Hello, everybody. Well, you got me again. Aspen is at her brother-in-law's graduation this week, so she should be back here next week. So I'm going to just do one lesson. And what I wanted to highlight today is just staying faithful to God. So we're going to start off by talking about God's chosen people. And what an honor that must be to be called God's chosen people. I mean, you would feel special. The God of the universe has chosen you to be his people. And so we're talking about the Israelites first. And I wanted to start with some of the history of Israel. And I'm going to begin with Joseph and how God protected Jacob, or Israel, and his family. So we all probably remember that Joseph was loved the most out of all his brothers. And it wasn't a hidden fact. His brothers knew it. His father, gave Joseph the coat of many colors. And this created hatred towards Joseph from his brothers. And they sold him into slavery. So that's Genesis 37, 12 through 28. But we can read that Joseph had God's perspective through all of this, that he had God's will in mind. So in Genesis 45, 4 through 8, and I reread these and rewrote these, so hopefully I don't have any big mistakes.
Genesis 37, what were the verses?
12 through 28. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God." So the brothers really had to trust that what Joseph was saying was true. But knowing human nature, they had their doubts. So when their father died, which was Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, they were worried. And they decided they better start plotting to keep Joseph off their, to not get their hide, whatever. So in Genesis 50, 15 through 17, then Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead. They said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for the evil we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgressions of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of God of your father." So they were trying to, appeal to Joseph's love for his father. But they didn't need to. Joseph's forgiveness wasn't because of the love for his father. It was because he truly knew he was doing God's will. He truly, truly believed that, and that he was an instrument. He could go through slavery, which would bring hardships, show weakness in himself. He was in an unknown land. He was in an unknown land with an unknown people. And there were times he would not have enough to eat or drink. And when he was falsely accused and then thrown into prison, he was alone. But we know that he still would trust God. After going through all of this, he would still reassure his brothers of his forgiveness. So in verse 20 of chapter 50, he told them again, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, saving many lives. So I want you guys to just think, he wasn't surrounded by like-minded people. He wasn't surrounded by other Jews who would say, hey, we're God's people. Or Jewish nation wasn't even established yet, but they knew that they were a chosen people already. But he wasn't around people who might encourage him with these words. He had to rely already on his knowledge of God. So now the Israelites, they all had land to live on. They were all kind of staying in the land of Egypt. And this first generation has now died. And Joseph and his brothers and the dad and even the king who had great regard for Joseph. But a new king was to come. So in Exodus 1, 6 through 14, Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation, but the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Rameses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and bricks and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So again, evil's intended. Again, the fear of man towards these people, he would enslave them. And now that evil that the king exercised would not stop there. He wanted all the boy babies killed. And who was powerful enough to defy him? Who was going to stand up to him and say, no, we're not doing that? Exodus 1:17. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. So what would have been the consequence to these midwives? Surely would have been death. If Pharaoh knew of their disobedience, but they feared God more than they feared man. And I would kind of venture to say most of us probably don't even remember their names. But it's found in verse 15, Sapphira and Puah, P-U-A-H. Because they feared God more than God could use them. And then we see in Proverbs 16 at the end of verse 6, through the fear of the Lord, evil is avoided. Because they feared the Lord, the baby boys would live. And through that, we had Moses. Genesis 2:23. Oh, I was going to read let me see where that went.
I'm doing this study about tree of life and all that stuff, but Moses in the basket is another recreation of the Noah story. And then the ark, and the ark for Noah is the wood, tree of life. Anyway, it's really cool, but it just reminded me when you said Moses in the basket. That was he decreated the world by bringing the flood and then recreated it.
Right.
Noah, and I was like, that was Moses, and he is the one who led. He recreated the path for those people.
But I just come back to the midwives. that the midwives were also in a heathen nation, and yet they still had the fear of the Lord. They were still being taught the fear of the Lord. And in verse 20 of Exodus 1, so God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. Okay, now I got to catch up on my notes. So, God would hear Israel and not leave them hopeless. We know that they were enslaved and, left to do the burden. And chapter 2, verse 23, during those many days the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and with Jacob. So I'm not going to go through the whole story of Moses and Pharaoh.
What was that verse?
Oh, I'm sorry, 2:23, Exodus 2. I said Genesis, I meant Exodus, sorry. You're like, wait, that's not what Genesis says. But Exodus 2:23. So I'm not going to go through the history of Moses and Pharaoh, but it suffices to say that Pharaoh did not know God, did not want to know God, and thought he was the most powerful. In fact, in Exodus 5:2, who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? So I'm bringing all this up to show that we all have fears. And there's fears that can bring us closer to God and fears that can bring us away from God. So we're going to highlight 5 fears that I see in Israel that brought them away from God. So the first fear that I want to highlight is the fear of hardship. So this is found in Exodus 5:7 through 19. And Moses had already gone to Pharaoh and asked for Pharaoh to let his people go. God was talking through Moses to let his people go so that they might worship him and offer sacrifice. So now in verse 7, you shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks, as in the past. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. But the number of bricks that they made in the past you shall impose on them. You shall no means reduce it, for they are idle. Therefore they cry, let us go off and sacrifice to our God. Let heavier work be laid on the men, that they may labor at it, and pay no regard to lying words. So the taskmasters and the foremen of the people went out and said to the people, thus says Pharaoh, I will not give you straw. Go and get your straw yourselves, wherever you can find it. But your work will not be reduced in the least. So the people were scattered throughout all the land of Egypt to gather stubble for straw. The taskmasters were urgent, saying, complete your work, your daily task each day, as when there was straw. And the foremen of the people of Israel, whom Pharaoh's taskmasters had set over them, were beaten and asked, why have you not done all your task of making bricks today and yesterday, as in the past? And the foreman of the people of Israel came and cried to Pharaoh, why do you treat your servants like this? No straw is given to your servants, yet they say to us, make bricks. And behold, your servants are beaten, but the fault is in your own people. But he said, you're idle. You're idle. That is why you say, let us go and sacrifice to the Lord. Go now and work. No straw will be given to you, but you must still deliver the same number of bricks. So the Israelites tried to compel Pharaoh to be reasonable. But Pharaoh wasn't reasonable. In fact, he tried to plant the seed of choosing comfort over sacrificing to God. The Israelites were the people in God, and they were enslaved. So they had known importance of sacrificing to God, But to them it wasn't worth the price they had to pay. So they confronted Moses and Aaron in verse 20 and 21 of the same chapter, and they said, "May the Lord look on you and judge you." They blamed Moses and Aaron, the men of God, and they wanted them to stop seeking God on their behalf. This challenge even made Moses question God's motives. So in verse 22 and 23, then Moses turned to the Lord and said, "O Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak your name, he has done evil to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all." But God replied to Moses a promise of deliverance in Exodus 6:1. The Lord said to Moses, "Now you shall see what I will do. Go to Pharaoh, for the strong hand he will send them out, and with a strong hand he will drive them out." So we're going to fast forward through the 10 plagues. Oh, first I wanted to say how Satan uses lies. He used the lie that to them that they were being idle, therefore they had time to go worship. And he uses lies to us. Sometimes I hear this, that they act like our freedom in Christ is slavery. And our friends who aren't Christians might say, "Oh, you have to go to church. Oh, you have to, I can go do this," like they're free. But they kind of flip the switch or the narrative. And that's what I see Pharaoh doing. He was convincing them that their hardships would go away. All they had to do was stop seeking God. Stop wanting to please God and sacrifice to him. And they were imploring their leaders, "Don't go to Pharaoh on our behalf. It's making our life so much worse." So this is going to bring us to our next fear, and I'm going to call it the fear of might. So we know the 10 plagues and that Pharaoh did allow the people to go, but he did change his mind. So in Exodus 14, 10 through 12, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." So when they saw this approaching army, all they could see was their weakness. God had already demonstrated his power. God had already demonstrated that.
Can you say what scripture that was? I think I wrote it down right.
14, 10 through 12.
Okay, I wrote 4. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I think I talked too fast. But anyway, so they were looking at their power to save them. God had already demonstrated to them his power, and yet they were frozen with fear at the power of an army marching on them. They wished they had just been left alone, left as slaves, left in their weakness, left to serve a man who didn't care about them as a god. But once again, God will show his power, and they'll cross the sea on dry land as that same sea engulfs Pharaoh, and they'll be done with him once and for all. And so in Exodus 15, they all would sing praises to God, and so I'm sure they were grateful. And they were relieved that they were rescued. But now, in verse 22, there's another crisis. So I'm going to call this the fear of the unknown. They didn't have a place to call home, and nothing was familiar. Chapter 15, 22 through 24. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Moriah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That is why the place is called Moriah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" I see that, they're walking for 3 days. They don't know the land, and they find finally some water that they need. And so it was what they thought, oh, finally, and they went up and they started to drink, and the water wasn't any good. So sometimes we have a problem, and then what we think might be a solution presents itself, and we rush to it only to be disappointed, and then we lash out at God, or, and that's essentially what they were doing, even though it was lashing out at Moses and Aaron. So verse 25, the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it in the water, and the water became sweet. There the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them, saying, if you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God, and do which is right in his eyes, and give ear to his commands, and keep all his statute, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer. So, they camped by this water now for about 2.5 months, and God provided for them again, as he continuously did. But that would not last, their contentment. So the next fear that I'm going to look at is the fear of not enough. Exodus 16:2-3, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. So, you might be wondering why I'm labeling this fear of not enough. God provided for them food and asked a specific way for them to gather the food. In verse 4, then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I'm about to rain bread from heaven on you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I might test them whether they will walk in my law or not. And on the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. Then verse 15-20, when the people of Israel saw that they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, it is bread that the Lord has given to you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it, each one of you, as much as he can eat. You shall each take an omer according to the number of persons that each of you has in his tent. And and the people of Israel did with, I'm getting all my words off. And the people of Israel did so. They gathered some more, some less, but nothing left over. And whoever gathered little had no lack. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat. And Moses said to them, let no one leave any of it over till morning. But they did not listen to Moses, and some left part of it till morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. Sometimes we can place our security in our possessions, and instead of God's provisions every day. And God wanted to show them that he could trust them, that they could trust him. Which brings us to the last fear. Man, I have a lot left. I gotta hurry.
You said there were 5?
Yeah.
Hardship, fear of not enough.
Unknown.
Which was the 4th one?
Or the 3.
Third one. And so I'm going to call this one the fear of not trusting. So the people would again quarrel and accuse Moses and God of just rescuing them to have them die later. In Exodus 17:1-3, the whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded, and they camped at Rephidim. I'm butchering that name, I'm sure. But there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. And Moses replied, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test? But the people were thirsty for water, and they grumbled against Moses, and they said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" God had already given them water, so why wouldn't they just ask? Why are they doubting? Why would they go again to Moses grumbling? And I think it was from a lack of trust. So 4-7, Moses cried out to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, take in with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go, behold, I will stand before you there on the rock of Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and the water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders in Israel, and he called the name of the place Massa and Merida, because of the quarreling and the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" So God had provided safety from a tyrant, safety from hostility, safety from discomfort, safety with provision, and what would cause them to question if the Lord was with them except for a lack of trust. So, man, I have a lot left. That wasn't even the main part of my lesson. Yeah, because I was just reading too much. So God had already shown him who he was and that he could be trusted and that he was going to provide. And yet, one more verse in Exodus 32:6-12, and they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, for your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.' And the Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore, let me alone, that my wrath might burn hot against them, and I may consume them in order that they may and I will make a great nation of you.' But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, 'O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out to kill them in the mountain and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people.'" So God was ready to destroy him, but Moses, and if Moses was seeking to, elevate himself, this was his opportunity. But Moses saw God for who he was, and he saw God's people for who they were. And that was all of that. Now, I wanted to talk about Hosea. I just wanted a little history, but I'm only going to have 3 minutes on Hosea.
Standalone lesson, you said.
Huh?
Standalone lesson.
I know. So Hosea was a prophet sent to the northern kingdom of Israel. And God gave Hosea, his prophet, a hard challenge to marry a promiscuous woman. Not the girl next door, someone with a wandering eye, someone with itchy feet. So all of those are watered down words. God asked Hosea to marry a sex worker, to marry a prostitute, to marry a whore. He was faithful. And in this allegory, Hosea is God, and God's loving towards Israel, and Israel's unfaithfulness. And it is a heartbreaking story. And I think it's something we can all kind of relate to. So in Hosea 1:2, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go take to yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord. And then God's going to name Hosea's children. I'm having to skip over some of this. So in Gomer, his wife would bear 3 children, and God named each of these children. And the first one was a son who God named Jezreel, after the valley of Jezreel. And that's in Hosea 1:3-5. So Jezreel was a place known for its beauty and richness in 1 Kings 21, 1-16. It was also known because of a vineyard owned by Naboth. I'm sure you guys remember that story. And that Ahab wanted that vineyard, and Naboth refused to sell him the vineyard. And Ahab went and put a pity party on for himself. And when Jezebel saw him not getting up to eat, she said, "What's going on?" And he told him about this vineyard he really wanted. So Jezebel, being cunning and evil, she sent Naboth and some false accusers to accuse him and have him stoned so that Ahab could confiscate that vineyard. And that was in Jezreel. And then God also commanded Jehu to kill Jezebel. Let's find the other king's names here. But anyway, that's 2 Kings 9, 17-37, and 10, 1-14. 2 Kings 9, 17-37, and 10, 1-14. I can't see where the other kings' names were. I should have highlighted them. And then that's the same place in 2 Kings 15, 8-12, that the judgment of Jehu's dynasty on the kingdom of Israel was in that same place. So this could possibly mean referring to a place of judgment. The second one was a daughter, and Hosea 1, 6-7 was to name her, no mercy or no pity. So God was going to have judgment on Israel. Then he would have no mercy. And the third son, Lo Ami, which means not my people. So that seems harsh. God was going to remove his mercy, remove them as his people, and have judgment on them. But we also know that God's loving and that God is faithful. And God was faithful to his covenant. So Hosea 1, 10-11, I'm just going to give you that verse to go back and look at later. That God isn't going to leave them in that state. Then in chapter 2, we see this harlot living with another man. A man that doesn't care for her, a man that hasn't committed to her, a man that it doesn't love her. And she's giving him all the glory and all of the, I can't think of the right word, accolades for the things that actually the husband has given her, or God had given to Israel. So in verse 5 of chapter 2, she said, "I will go after my lovers who gave me my bread, my water, my wool, my flax, my oil, and my drink." When actually it was God who had given those to her. And she wasn't acknowledging that. So I'm sorry we have to kind of leave it there. These first two chapters are really show us how loving God is, because we can fall into the same category. We're God's people now, and we can let different fears make us lose our focus. And so I just wanted to read one last verse in 1 Peter 2:10. "Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." So anyway, thank you, ladies. Sorry I had to rush through that.